Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing today? Good. Everybody got some coffee? Getting the day going? Good. I'm Michael Freilich. I'm a principal focused on financial institutions with AT Kearney. This is Bronwyn Kitchen.
I'm a manager in the Melbourne office in the FIG practice, and I'm actually down at secondment at NAB at the moment. So I've got a sort of an insider's look at this stuff.
Yes. So we're going to talk about data today. We're going to talk about data privacy, how companies and people are navigating this space. And I thought that we would start the discussion today at the very beginning, actually, with the creation of data itself. This is Claude Shannon. Claude Shannon was an American mathematician. At the ripe age of 21, Claude Shannon wrote his master's thesis at MIT called Digital Circuit Theory. He was the person that figured out that Boolean algebra could be computed using electrical circuits. And this is the very foundations of computing. He was around for the creation of the bit, which is our smallest unit of data that we have. He was a contemporary of Albert Einstein, of Kurt Gödel, Alan Turing. Alan Turing was another one of the fathers of modern computing. He and Alan Turing worked together during World War II on cryptography. And it was during this work that Claude Shannon really was out of this work, where he wrote his most famous paper, which was a paper called The Mathematical Theory of Communication. And it was in this paper that he defined how information can travel across a noisy channel. For Claude Shannon, the problem was, how do you resolve what happens when information is traversing this channel? And I thought that this quote was really interesting because while for Shannon, information was about resolving uncertainty, today information is actually the cause of much of the uncertainty that we have. It creates uncertainty for consumers, and it certainly creates a lot of uncertainty for businesses. What we're going to talk about today is what drives this uncertainty. We're going to talk about how consumers are perceiving it, and we're going to talk about how regulators and businesses are responding. It will be of no surprise to anyone that the amount of data created is increasing exponentially. It's not a particularly new thought. Data comes not just from our apps, from Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. It comes from our phones. It comes from our cars. It comes from our Fitbits. It comes from machines that we interact with every day. There is this, I like to think of this exhaust of data sort of coming off of humanity, everything that we do and everything that we interact with. And the meaning of data has actually changed over time. One of the geniuses of Claude Shannon that came out of that work was that information, whether it's audible, visual, text, is actually all the same thing. And we've been able to measure more and more things, not just calls coming into the call center, but angry calls coming into the call center. And most of this data that's being created is actually about us, right? It's about consumers. It's about what we do. And the idea of data created and tracked about consumers is not a new concept. The traditional custodians of this, before the Amazons, Googles, and Facebooks of the world came into being, were the credit reporting agencies. And those agencies can actually trace their origins back to the late 1800s. After the Civil War in the US, people began moving into cities, and shopkeepers in cities would keep track of whether or not someone is reliable and paying their bills. You can imagine going into a butcher shop in Brooklyn, getting your meat. A week later, the shopkeeper writes down, did Michael pay back his debts? It wasn't just the butcher that was doing this. It was all of the shops in the neighborhood that were doing this. And eventually, this data began to be aggregated. Someone had the idea to aggregate it. This grew and grew and grew, not only the kinds of data that was being collected, but of course, across geographies. This all came to a head, actually, in 1966 in the US. There was a big scandal and a big congressional hearing because it turns out that data was being collected on people that was rather unsavory, and they weren't being treated fairly. So data like personality traits, or really opinions about personality traits, drinking habits, whether you were divorced, right? All of this stuff was being used and people were being treated unfairly. The outcome of this was the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which began to regulate these credit reporting agencies. After that, big consolidation across this industry, and we're left with the three big reporting agencies we have today, which is Transamerica, Experian, and Equifax. This last one, Equifax, some of you may know, was the recent victim of a massive data breach. 143 million consumer records were stolen. This is records like social security numbers, credit cards, bank accounts, all of this kind of information. And which brings us to this next point, which is, as all of the data has grown, both in volume, variety, velocity, right, all of these things, the ability to control it, regulate it, and manage it has become much more difficult. This chart shows just I would say, a small subset of the data breaches that are happening today. You can see that there is sort of an increase over time. Horrible things happen when there's a data breach. Horrible things happen to consumers. This is where identity theft and all of this comes from. And horrible things happen to companies. LinkedIn saw a 43% decrease in stock price after their data breach. The Equifax data breach is expected to cost Equifax over $600 million. And so you can see this is sort of the dark side of data, right? Between these two exhibits, we have really two macro trends, right? We have data getting greater and really more value being extracted from data. And you have data being more difficult to control, breaches, and sort of this dark side. What we're going to do is talk about three stories that illustrate how companies are navigating this kind of landscape of the value and the harm. I don't think we can give a talk about data privacy without talking about Facebook. I also don't think I need to talk about the great things about Facebook. It's probably one of the, if not the greatest consumer product that came out of the internet age. And there are some troubling things about what has happened at Facebook recently, and actually going back a bit a ways at Facebook. Of course, probably the biggest troubling thing is all of this election meddling that is happening on the platform, not just in the US, but around the world. What I want to make a point here is that it's not really just Facebook that's the problem. That there is a much bigger issue around data privacy. While Facebook has a lot of data about a lot of people, very personal data, if you download your Facebook data, it depends how much you use the platform, but you might get 500, 600 megabytes of data back. If you download your Google data, you'll get 10 times that, right? So this is not really, the issue around Facebook is a much broader issue. There are a huge percentage of companies that really use surveillance-based business models. They give you something for free. In return, you consent to giving them your data. And indeed, this is built into the very foundations of the internet. A cookie on your machine and your IP address can tell an awful lot about you. And this information is shared almost any time an ad is served up on your website. Some value has been created out of that data. I'm not going to talk about Facebook's go-forward strategy. There's so much written about that. And I actually don't think the whole regulatory, certainly in the US, issues have played out. But what I will say is that it's a great example of a company very publicly sort of navigating this landscape of the value that's created for consumers and also some of the harm that can be done as a result of that. The next story is going to bring us to China. I assume everybody is aware, knows about Alibaba. Is it yes, head nods? Alibaba is the largest e-commerce platform in the world. They have an affiliated company called Ant Financial. Ant Financial is the largest fintech company in the world. They have a capability called Alipay. This is a ubiquitous payment system across China. Ant Financial has come up with a new offering, which is a private credit score. It's called Sesame Credit. And Sesame Credit is based on all of the data that Alibaba has on you. So there are 5 things that go into a person's Sesame Credit score. The first is sort of traditional credit history. So do you pay your bills? The second is your ability to pay, so your sort of fulfillment capacity. The third is some personal information about you, email, phone number, this kind of thing. The fourth is your behavior. So what do you shop for? What are you buying? What do you stream? What do you post? That goes into the score. And the last thing, and maybe the most troubling, is the scores of your friends. So if your friends are doing well, you're doing well. If your friends have issues, you might have issues. It is a social credit score. This is becoming increasingly ubiquitous. There are some great things that come from this, right? It reduces friction in retail transactions. It creates access to financial products from people who have traditionally not had access to them. It creates, in theory, stability in the economy because trust is more embedded in a transaction. And I think it's also not that hard to see the dark side of this. And indeed, some of that dark side is appearing. So there's reports that the Chinese government is building a social credit score that is government-run. Your score goes up when you do good things like donate blood or volunteer your time or donate money, and your score goes down when you do some unsavory things or you break the law. And there are reports where this is being piloted of people's rights being curbed as a result of their low score. I don't know if anybody is a Black Mirror fan from Netflix. Excellent show. There's an episode that takes this idea of this social score sort of to the nth degree. You know, person ends up in prison and all of this. It's a great illustration of that. Between these first 2 examples, Facebook and then Sesame Credit, you can see there are times when the regulatory bodies are sort of way behind what is happening in technology. I think it's fair to say that's the case, certainly in the US. And there are times when the regulatory bodies are right on top of it and leveraging this technology just like companies are. So the last example is the Golden State Killer example. Has anybody heard about the Golden State Killer? Some head nods. This was very big news in the US the last 2-3 weeks. So the Golden State Killer is a person who in the late 70s and early 80s committed over 50 rapes, some murders, 100 break-ins all across the state of California. The lead investigator on this case was a guy named Paul Holes. And for over the course of about 30 years, Paul Holes was able to sort of connect one person to this string of crimes, but was never able to find the guy, could never find the person. Last year, Paul Holes had the idea to take some intact DNA that they had from the Golden State Killer and upload it to a genealogy website. Does everybody know these websites, Ancestry.com and all of this? He created a fake profile, I think Paul Holes would refer to it as undercover, and uploaded the information. What came back was a family tree of this person. It went back to the great-great-great-grandparents of the Golden State Killer, and what they had was a suspect list, the leaves of the tree, that they had never had before. With the information that they had gathered about this person over the last 30 years, they used that, narrowed it down to one guy. The story is that it is Paul Holes' last day of work. He's about to retire. He drives to this guy's house, almost knocks on the door and doesn't. He didn't feel he had enough sort of proof that he was the actual person. They surveilled him, they gathered some more DNA, they ran it through, and they had an exact match. He's then arrested, and this was big news. So there's something, again, blurry, ethically blurry about this situation. There was nothing illegal about what Paul Holes and the investigators did. DNA can be used with cause. It's been that way for a long time. and the idea of being undercover is new. What I think is blurry about this one is that, one, the data that's being used is, right, this is like the essence of who we are. So this is the DNA. The other thing about it is that in some sense you had a relative of this person implicating them in a crime without either of them knowing, right? And there's something that feels a little bit difficult about that. So we have these three examples, right? We have Facebook kind of navigating this area of value and harm. We have Sesame Credit using the proliferation of behavioral data to create new credit scores. And we have the example of DNA being used. And I think inherent in this example is DNA publicly available, in essence. What we're going to talk about now is how consumers are perceiving this, right? How they're perceiving these changes. So A.T. Kearney does a survey every year. We survey 7,000 consumers above the 18 years old and that are banked. So these are people who have a bank account and they are conducting digital transactions. And the first exhibit is how concerned are you about sharing data when you're doing digital things? 50% of people are very or extremely concerned about sharing data. The next exhibit asks about compensation for sharing. And we have actually over half of people saying they're likely, somewhat likely, to share information when they're doing a digital transaction. To some degree, that's inherent in the transaction. But I think this is an interesting one because, one, it is kind of a proof point around loyalty programs, right, that have existed. The second thing that I think it shows is why consumer behavior actually hasn't changed all that much when you look at all of the data breaches and all of the issues that have gone on with data. The next example is about payment and purchase data. 34% of people believe it is an invasion of privacy to use this data. This is an important one to keep in mind when we hear Bronwyn talk about how companies are responding and what open data is doing. The potential of open data. And this last exhibit, there's a bunch of things sort of to take away on this page. I'm going to talk about this fourth one here, which is about control. 90% of respondents believe that they should be able to control their data. And this, to me, is quite shocking, actually. It's shocking because there seems to be a massive gap between what consumers believe they should be able to do and what actually is happening on the ground. And in some sense, consumers have never been able to control their data, not even in the 1800s. And so I think this is where a lot of the regulatory trends come into play. And we'll now pivot to that discussion. I'll hand over to Bronwyn to talk about what's happening.
Thank you. So we've heard quite a lot about the growing value and volume of data floating around out there, and how that's sort of driving an increase in awareness and concern by consumers. I'd like to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about how governments are responding to that concern and how organisations like ours can perhaps leverage that government response. The first thing to note is that around the world, governments, regulators are beefing up or putting in place new data protection, data privacy laws. In the EU, GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regulation, is about to be enacted next week. The UK has augmented their Data Protection Act. And in Australia, we've just announced the Consumer Data Right, which will be an economy-wide right. So though the details differ excuse me, between jurisdictions, the intent is essentially the same. That is that consumers own their data and they have a right to access it and share it with third parties. The regulations put in place controls around how data can be captured, how it can be stored and how it can be used. It puts in place a framework for penalising breaches. So the Consumer Data Right is intended to be an economy-wide initiative, and the first industry to which it's going to apply is open banking. Is the banking industry, which is known as open banking. So what this means is that as a consumer, you'll be able to ask any accredited provider to extract your bank data from your other bank. What this means is that every provider, if you want them to, will be able to know you as well as your existing bank. The idea being that it should be able to increase transparency of prices and enable switching. The interesting thing about this particular regulation is that though it started with a consumer data right and the allowing consumers to control their data, it has a secondary objective, and that is to promote competition in industries where information asymmetry is actually a barrier to entry at the moment. So telcos and energy are likely to be the next cabs off the rank, but this is envisioned to roll out across all industries over the next several years. So banks have been, or at least should have been, thinking about open banking for some time. This is not new news for them. But what I'd like to tell you about today is my theory that this is actually a huge opportunity for non-banks. So under the open banking regulation, anyone will be able to be accredited as a third party that can transact in this environment. What that means is that if you're a telco or an energy company, this is coming up for you, but if you're a retailer, an advertising company, there are possibly some opportunities here for you too. So if you think about the kind of information that is stored in bank data, and transaction data in particular, there's a really rich and robust set of insights you can draw from that. I mean, the main ones obviously being spending habits, so where customers are spending their money, how much they're spending and where they're spending it. But you can also get a sense for where people are in their lives based on where they're spending their money. And based on sort of recurring income and expenses, you can get a sense of affordability for your customers that you wouldn't have before. The interesting thing for me is that if you combine that with the proprietary data that you have on your customers, you'll be able to layer that on top and really develop some really valuable propositions for your customers. And I think that's probably the key point here, is that this started as a consumer-based regulation to give them choice and control. And because they have control, any of this stuff is only going to be possible if you can show to them the value of sharing their data with you. So walking that line between sort of generating value and being convenient versus being creepy is going to be a really important one to navigate. So I've got some ideas up here. These haven't been run past these players. These are just my thoughts on what I would do if I were a non-bank. The first is if I were Facebook. So Facebook is does an amazing job already of linking your internet behaviour and sharing that as ads in your banners. And so this is super lucrative for them, as Mark Zuckerberg has been describing. But imagine if they then knew what your purchasing behaviour was, if they could link your browsing behaviour with your actual purchases and sell that back to those retailers, they could be sure that what they were showing you was relevant. Not just those retailers' competitors. So that gives them a real edge in how they share that kind of information. The reverse is also true. So what they'll be able to show, or what they'll be able to derive, is based again on that sort of that click-through behaviour. They'll be able to understand what kind of campaigns appeal to particular consumers, and they'll be able to tweak their messages to make those more nuanced, to make them again drive the kinds of behaviours that advertisers are paying for. The second is retails, and my example here is Woolworths. So if you're Woolworths, hopefully you've already got your customers in your loyalty program. So you already have a pretty good sense for what they spend at Woolworths. But what if you now knew how much they were spending at Coles, when they were spending at Coles, which Coles they were going to? There are a couple of things you can pull out here. The first one is share of wallet. So you can understand what's driving, you should be able to correlate at least what's driving spend in different locations. So is it a particular campaign based on products that you know that consumer buys regularly? Or is it perhaps location based? If you can see other purchases in a particular geolocation, you can say, okay, they've gone to Coles because that's convenient. The other thing is that you should be able to think about where new stores are going to be relevant, because you can see where, again with that geolocation idea, where where your customers are shopping that's not Woolworths, but that they would hopefully shop at Woolworths if you were there. The third example is big ticket sellers. My example here is Qantas. So generally these kinds of retailers have issues with pipeline dropout. So people browse for their holidays, they realise how much it's going to cost, and then they go, okay, I probably need to save up for that a little bit. So what if, as Qantas, you could offer point of sale credit? So some kind of private label afterpay based on a customer's transaction history, which allowed you to understand their creditworthiness, allowed you to go around perhaps the credit card schemes with those 3% charges. I can imagine some opportunities here for those sorts of companies. I think my point here is that bank data is interesting for banks, other banks, fintech, but it's also it should be really interesting to anyone who is interested in personalising or tailoring their products for their customers. And I think this is just the tip of the iceberg. You combine bank data and eventually put telco on top, maybe energy on top of that. You know, the combinations and permutations are kind of endless, and I think we'll see a real growth in this space over the next 5 to 10 years. The next thing I'd like to talk about is sort of drawing on my experiences at NAB, having watched them go through the sort of the open banking strategy and implementation process. What some sort of generalised learnings could be for the next couple of industries to be regulated in this way. So I have 3 pieces of advice, and these are coming from a non-technical standpoint. So just having watched the sort of the panic and the crunch that's happened over the last little while, trying to work out how on earth we're going to comply with the regulations in such a short time frame. So the first is data-proof your infrastructure. If you're building infrastructure now, build it so it doesn't need to be rebuilt. Privacy by design, security by design, API-enabled everything. It's not cheap, but if it's going to happen anyway, do it on your terms. Do it now in a sort of a planned and structured way. The second idea is master your customers. So if you've got data on your customers now, now's the time to flex those analysis muscles, learn about your customers, generate value for them with their data. Because if you don't, a smaller, smarter entrant is going to do so shortly. Build awareness inside your company. So talk to the other executives about the size of the opportunity and the threat here. Get them comfortable with the risks and the controls that are associated. And start thinking about those non-infrastructure things that need to be put in place. So processes around governance, risk management, the legal things that need to be in place. So my example here is, one of the ways that NAB has prepared for open banking is via a bilateral data sharing agreement with Xero cloud accounting package. The interesting thing here is that it's a data sharing arrangement whereby the Xero balance sheet data appears on the NAB platform. So what you can see here is essentially a working capital platform, and you can do payments directly in the Xero platform, which means that customers don't need to download their CSV files, upload them again. So it's solving a huge pain point for customers, and it's quite new, but there have been positive reports so far. But what it does is it allows us to do all of this stuff at NAB sort of a little bit ahead of the curve. So we've built the infrastructure, the APIs around the SMEs. We've built a loan product called QuickBiz, which actually uses the accounting data to make decisions. And we've pushed all this stuff through the risk and legal process. So there is a precedent for how we treat data sharing going forward. Which is great. Now that we're at the point where we need to implement, we've got timelines, we've got some clear scope. We now know what it takes to do this stuff. We know that it's hard. We know the time, effort and resources that are associated with it, and we can plan accordingly. The last thing that is actually super helpful is that we can talk credibly to the regulators while they're thinking about how they implement this stuff. We can talk about sort of the risks and controls we've already identified, and help them on their implementation plan. So I guess my point here is that open data is coming. Industries who it is going to apply to should be starting to plan now. And industries who it's not going to apply to yet, there are huge opportunities here. to come up with over the next few years.
Great. And so we'll close the talking part of the discussion today with a older and wiser Claude Shannon, and with maybe just a message about what this means for us. The way technology enters our lives, the way data sort of expands in the way that it is, none of this is inevitable, actually, right? It is all the result of decisions that we make. And as members of the corporate community, as people that have some influence over what happens in regulatory bodies, it is sort of incumbent upon us to do this in a responsible way, to understand these issues. Bronwyn talked about some of the no regret kind of things that companies can do. It is a huge opportunity that lies ahead here. And the trick will be in how companies sort of navigate both the value that can be created and the potential harm that can be done. And with that, we will open it up for some questions. Anybody? No questions? Sure.
I'll kick it off. Yeah, I was interested in the retailing example. If I was to opt into sharing my banking data, is that the end of the traditional loyalty scheme in terms of my Flybuys account and a separate card and tapping that?
I wouldn't think so. I would think that for companies that can generate proprietary data, so data that nobody else has or can get, is actually going to be extremely valuable, just because of the extra nuance that it's allowing you to generate and the insights associated with that.
Yeah, or here, yeah.
So you talked a lot about the control aspect, and obviously like consumers want to control their data, but a lot of what happens with the data happens with algorithms and things that people don't understand and
Right.
can't really comprehend. So how do big organisations deal with that aspect of it?
Yeah, no, excellent point, and I'm glad you brought it up. One of the things that is sort of, I think, just going to get out of the screen, that is conspicuously missing, actually, from this talk is a discussion about algorithms. Because actually, the data is just bits floating around. It's actually what companies do with them, these algorithms that are developed on top of the data, that is actually what's impacting people's lives, right? And creating the value associated with them. There is a huge field of study that is just starting around algorithm audits. And there's actually a great book by a woman by the name of Cathy O'Neill. It's called Weapons of Math Destruction. And it is about how some of these algorithms are pervasive in our society, whether it's around loans. There's a great example around recidivism. The likeliness of a criminal to go back in prison that impacts sentencing guidelines. They all use data, the data that we've been talking about. And data is a reflection of what we do, but it's actually not a perfect reflection, and it's full of bias. And so how algorithms are dealing with that data and dealing with that bias is kind of a new field of study that I think is very important. Cathy O'Neill actually started a consulting company that does algorithm audits, so testing algorithms and making sure that they're unbiased, that people are selecting the right risk, this kind of thing. Yeah.
Do you think there's an opportunity on the other side, so on the privacy side? So if I take Telstra, for example, or Telco, is there an opportunity where they could put a vault around my information and I could actually ask the banks to put my data into that vault and then I get to say who gets to use it? Do you think there's an opportunity for something like that on the other side of this sort of crazy data?
Absolutely. I mean, I can imagine an amazing product where I can tip all of my digital data.
I'm buying it. So.
Not just my bank data, but perhaps my legal records, my health records, a centralised, controlled place, which I guess becomes a little bit of a honeypot. So the vaultedness of that is going to become important. But I can imagine all sorts of associated products and even industries cropping up because of this.
There's a company called Trove some people may have heard it's an insurtech company, and you can upload your things that you've purchased, right? A bicycle or a fancy guitar or whatever, and you can turn insurance on or off, right? Depending on how you're using this. Well, if you talk to Scott Walchek, the CEO, it is not an insurance company. The idea behind Trove is that everybody is going to have a digital vault, right? Everybody is going to store their things digitally, and this is sort of the premise that company is based on. That kind of vault will potentially exist. Frank?
We're finding, of course, our clients are increasingly moving to cloudifying everything they do, and some of the data privacy laws of countries prevent individual identifiable customer data crossing country boundaries, and this has caused various anonymization methods to show up and new instances of cloud to be deployed country by country. Any commentary on that and what to do about it?
I'll take a stab. So, so the country by country issue is an interesting one, and I think that increasingly companies are running into this. In the U.S., actually the data privacy laws are going in the opposite direction than they are from Australia, UK. It's not, most of the U.S. is going in the opposite direction. But there was a law passed in February by both the Senate and the House to allow the internet providers, so Comcast, Verizon, AT&T, to sell your customer data, to do whatever they want with it. These were things that were repealed from protections put on by the Obama administration. This is going to create complexity, but I actually think that what's happening is, well, I'll make two comments, right? So one, there's a great article in The Hill by the head of financial services globally for A.T. Kearney, Bob Hedges, where he talks about this issue in the U.S. and that that the problem is actually going to get worse as a result of this. It's going to get worse because what Congress is doing is sort of in direct conflict with what consumers actually want, which is some of the data that is showing. And the hypothesis is that one day there will be an uproar, and there's going to be legislation that swings back the other way, causing all sorts of problems for companies. I think the other way that and this is more just an observation, is that companies are beginning to pivot their privacy policies according to where the most stringent policies are existing, right? So I have received a whole bunch of new privacy notifications as a result of GDPR in Europe. So that, and I think the idea behind this is that companies are trying to limit the number of variables that happen across geographies.
Question. So you made the point that a lot of the reason for these changes is because customers want to control their data. But the flip side that I hear is that it's compliance, and companies are going to have to spend a lot of money in order to get up to par with the open bank, open telco, open entity. Do you think customers want that much control if they know that they're ultimately going to pay for it? And where's that equation going to?
Yeah.
I think it'll come back to the value that is presented to the customer. If I can show you how I can make I can make your loan application take 5 minutes instead of 5 days, I can imagine you saying, sure, have my data. Or I can imagine that if I could say, actually I'll be able to give you a much more tailored advice, then that's something that you'd essentially be willing to pay for with your data. But yeah, this is going to be hugely costly.
Such a learning curve, though, I imagine, to get to that point, so the customers pay for it in the meantime, I would imagine.
And all the shareholders.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing in the UK is that open banking sort of on a bit of a soft rollout at the moment, where they were supposed to comply by the 13th of Jan, and only 2 of the big 9 banks were able to comply in time. And it's one of those network things. There's no point in companies having all those APIs and having all those connections if it can't apply broadly. And the uptake has been slow because the value hasn't been able to be shown yet. But the regulators here have learned a lot of the lessons, I think, and I think the consumer education will be more significant, will be more invested in that.
Sure.
We mentioned hyper-targeting with data, especially in open banks, but also at the same time, consumers being more wary about the data and how it's being used. Do you see a tipping point there in terms of how targeted should the message be? Because consumers are obviously aware of us as marketers using their data and targeting them with a message that they like. Yeah, what do you see as a tipping point there?
So I reckon it won't be a tipping point. I actually reckon it'll grow and grow and grow. I don't know if anyone remembers the first time they saw a restaurant reservation on a Google map or a hotel reservation, and went, how did they know that? I've been reading my Gmail, that's creepy. And now you get really irritated if you look at your Gmail and wherever you're going is not in your maps. I think getting that line right between convenient and valuable and creepy is tough. But I think that line will actually change over time as people get used to the convenience and they get used to the idea that these things are actually these things are useful and helpful, so long as they don't tip over into sort of just shameless marketing of stuff that is not of interest.
I think maybe just to add, right, it goes back to this point around control, right, that actually consumers have never had control. And so how much sort of danger or harm comes into play as a result of these offerings, I think will be part of what happens in terms of the tipping point, right? I mean, during the Facebook hearings, I don't know if anybody watched them or just watched the highlights, but a lot of it was about control, and I think there was also, I think Mark Zuckerberg showed an openness to being involved in a discussion about regulations, and I think I would never make a prediction about what would happen in the U.S., but you could see a significant tightening, right, on how that data is able to be used. Maybe not in the U.S., maybe in other parts of the world, as a result of more harm that's being done.
So Scott Farrell, who wrote the open banking recommendations, has a view on this, and he is very adamant in his recommendations that consent be extremely explicit. None of this terms and conditions click here rubbish. These are the pieces of data that you are going to share with this organisation. It's going to be used for this use case and this use case only. Click on and off control here, and the banks will be required to have toggles where you can say just stop that sharing. I don't want it anymore. It's very clear that this is around consumer convenience, choice, and control, and not about the intent is not about opportunity, but I think there's huge amounts open to the people who do this in sort of a nuanced and customer-centric way.
I have a question about trust. So obviously trust in banks in Australia don't always go hand in hand, especially at the moment. And hearing all this, it's exciting, but maybe the opening creativity goes back to worrying about how do I know that I can trust banks with this sort of data? How would you say banks are responding to this, especially in the current climate, and why should I trust?
Yeah, that's a good question. Banks are really, really conscious of this, and trust is one of those things that can pretty much only be lost. It's very difficult to win. And so, quite rightly, trust in banks has decreased, but what I think you'll see is a lot of investment into areas that have been identified at the Royal Commission, separation of particular parts of the banks that it doesn't make sense anymore for them to be sufficiently customer-centric. I hope that this Royal Commission will be the last time anyone ever has to query whether a bank really has their customers' interests at heart. But I also think that this is an opportunity for customers to exercise some of that distrust and that concern, I suppose. Now you can see exactly what deal you might be able to get at another bank. Switch, leave the ones that you don't like. The big four are the main ones that are being bashed here, and rightly so. But there will be a huge number of entrants coming up here because it's going to be easier to offer new products to customers.
I think think just to add to it, the study that we showed around consumer data privacy, it was run by our financial institutions group. There's a whole part of it about custodians of data and how people perceive banks as a custodian. And actually, banks, I think, of all the industries was at the top or very near the top. I think it was 65% of people would trust a bank to hold this kind of data. And so the outcome of that, of course, is the point of view is that banks actually have a lot of control here and a lot of opportunity because, this may be changing in Australia, but that they're in a pretty good position actually to be a custodian or to be seen as a custodian of that data. Yeah.
Back to the digital vault. So who do you think in Australia is going to win that game? Obviously Aussie Post have got their digital ID. They've spanked $1 billion on that thing, hoping to win the Medibank deal that fell over. So who's going to win this digital ID piece?
It'll be people who come up with the best proposition, I think. Consumers are pretty fickle. They might be using Aussie Post at the moment, but if someone else comes up with something better, more comprehensive, easier to use, I think they'll go there. And I think this space is still open for existing corporations with existing customer relationships, or perhaps a new company. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts?
No, I just know that the Aussie Post one doesn't look like it's going to be the winner. So and obviously we still don't trust the banks. So whilst they might be able to get ahead and use this data well, where's going to be our sort of centre of trust? And I think there's a big opportunity in that. Well, potentially some startups. Who knows?
Could be. Yeah. Excellent. Well, thanks everybody for coming. Unless there are other questions.